The webinar is now live. Hello. I'm Abigail Backen. I'm going to be chairing our session today. We're waiting a little bit because one of our speakers is having some technical challenges.
I think those challenges have now been resolved.
Are we all here?
Yes, Suzanne is here.
Hi, Suzanne.
Hi. The only thing is now I've got to get, I've changed computers. I've got to get my talk on screen. So I'm so sorry about this.
No worries. I'm going to welcome everyone here. We have about 12 participants, I see. So Suzanne, would you prefer to go second and Chelsea will go first and you can...
You put me any place you want, not first though, because I'm trying to give my talk, okay?
Okay. So welcome everybody. Yeah, so this panel today is called Activism, Sexism, and Resistance. I'm very, very happy and very grateful to the Historical Materialism, La Grande Transition group in Montreal that's done a tremendous amount of work. Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, Elise. Thank you to the whole team. We have 3 presentations today. And so what I was going to do is introduce each of the talks and the speakers, and then they'll go in order, and then we'll have lots of time for conversation and discussion. So the first presentation, Chelsea, are you okay to go first? Okay, is called Activism, Sexism, and Resistance, Total System Failure in a Development NGO. It's presented by Chelsea Rhodes, who's a doctoral student at the Department of Social Justice Education at OISE, University of Toronto. The second presentation is called Reflections of a Lifetime of Feminist Activism. It's presented by Suzanne Berliner Weiss, who's a Holocaust survivor, activist, and author of an excellent book. If you haven't read it, you should, called Holocaust to Resistance, My Journey. And the third presentation is myself and Paul Kellogg. The title of that is Sexism, Socialism, and the Left, 3 case studies. I am Abigail Backen, Professor, Department of Social Justice Education at OISE at the University of Toronto. And Paul Kellogg is Professor, Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Athabasca University. So our basic format is that each speaker will present for about 15-ish minutes. And then if you have questions after that, please put them in the chat. And we'll be directing those towards all of the speakers, and we'll take them in bunches to facilitate as much conversation as possible. So thank you all for coming, and I'll pass it over to Chelsea. Chelsea, Elise is in the background and has offered to keep time for us, so she'll be giving you an indication when you have a couple minutes left.
Great.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Thanks, Abby. All right. I'm going to try to keep this within my time. So thanks everyone for being here. This can be a difficult topic to engage with. I know that everyone's already going through quite a lot of stress in the world. I also want to add a general content warning as I'll be referring to sexual violence in this presentation. So I'm going to be presenting a case study of a Canadian development NGO, which I'll refer to as the Progressive Organization, or TPO for short. So I think it can be useful to present cases like this and like the ones on this panel to tease out some of the common dynamics that are occurring, as well as looking at various attempts to put a stop to issues like this. To give the background and situate myself within this particular case, TPO is a development and anti-poverty organization based in Canada that claims to address the root causes of poverty and works in various countries, mostly in Africa. It's a membership organization with university and professional chapters across Canada. And like similar organizations, they send students, university students, on overseas placements, which are funded by the Government of Canada. I personally worked at TPO briefly in 2011 for about 8 months or so. During that time, I experienced harassment by my boss, as well as a range.
Under Abby, and it's Activism 903.
Elise, are you able to mute Suzanne? Thank you. Sorry about that. So I personally worked at TPO briefly in 2011 for about 8 months. During that time, I experienced harassment as well as backlash for bringing up issues with the organization's work, including racism, white saviors attitudes in the organization, gender discrimination, problems with its programming, issues with training, precarity of workers, and general health and safety issues. The backlash came primarily from my boss, as well as the executive team, which consisted of 3 white men. Like most NGOs and charities, the leadership structure, including the board of directors, was dominated by men and primarily white men. The harassment was so severe that I left my job and didn't report it to the organization until about a year after I had left. The executive team did a sort of sham investigation and then pressured me into an NDA or non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a small settlement. So that was all in around 2013. At that time, I also connected with a few others, so other volunteers or staff at the organization who were pushing back on issues in the organization, including the issue of their partnerships and donor relationships with oil and gas and mining companies. Those efforts didn't get much traction and mostly led to an exodus of frustrated members. So fast forward a few years, the unfolding of several external factors. So the very public downfall of Harvey Weinstein, the bursting into mainstream public consciousness of the Me Too movement in October of 2017, and rising awareness of sexual harassment as an important labor rights issue. By February of 2018, this led to a spinoff called Aid2, which started with revelations that Oxfam staff had abused women and girls in post-disaster Haiti. Other organizations experienced their own scandals, including bullying, sexual harassment, racism, paternalism, and corruption. Oxfam was followed by scandals at UNAIDS, Save the Children, Amnesty International, Planned Parenthood, We Charity, Doctors Without Borders, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, Equal Voice, World Health Organization, Catholic Relief Services, United Way, and most recently, the Gates Foundation. In most of these cases, nothing was done until whistleblowers went to the media or began publicizing the problems themselves on social media. So I think all of this led me and probably others at the organization to undergo what philosopher Sarah Ahmed refers to as feminist snap, which she explains as a certain kind of breaking point. She writes, "A snap signals that a life that one has been bearing is a life one is no longer willing to bear. A snap can be directed at one's own past bearing. You can snap because you're exhausted by having not snapped thus far and by what you've had to put up with." The breaking point is real and led me, along with several others, to craft a kind of public intervention. Myself and a small team of 3 others, including Alex, who is also here today. All of us were ex-staff or members of TPO, began collecting testimony from others who had been involved with the organization. In January of 2019, I virtually crashed the keynote speech at TPO's annual conference. The speaker was TPO's founder and former executive, the same man who had covered up the harassment towards me. And while he was speaking, I tweeted out a sort of alternate keynote using the conference hashtag. In doing so, I was also publicly breaking the NDA that had been imposed on me in 2013. Our attempts to spread the word about systemic issues at the organization were seriously helped along by executives getting up on stage at the conference and announcing to hundreds of people, "Don't pay attention to what's happening on Twitter," or something to that effect. They then held closed-door meetings with members where they told everyone that I was mentally ill and was lying. They then censored questions at that evening's AGM. So all of those attempts at repression led to my tweets being viewed something like 6,000 times by the end of that day. What unfolded after that is what me and my co-organizers soon came to realize is fairly textbook institutional repression. The organization hired a PR firm and legal counsel with charitable funds. Representatives of the board, executive team, with PR support, went on a kind of public non-apology tour. They conducted phone calls with chapter members and staff across Canada and internationally, apparently not considering the optics of 5 men leading the organizational response to allegations of gendered violence. People recorded those calls and sent them to us. An executive team member was recording telling a member blatant fabrications about me. So the organizational response and attempted repression drew a lot of attention to the issue, and our team was flooded with additional revelations stretching back about a decade, which we eventually relayed to the board of directors. We documented about 35 incidents, including sexual assault and rape, harassment, various forms of discrimination, bullying, and even financial fraud. We actually reported that those issues twice to the board in person in 2019, and up to now, nothing has been done. During this time, a few other things happened. 8 of the 13 board members at that time resigned. All of the men on the board resigned, leaving 5 women on the board. We at the time thought that things might take a turn for the better. Unfortunately, we were quite mistaken, and they continued to cover up everything and even escalated the retaliation. This was re-traumatizing, of course, as was its intent, but it also served the useful purpose of warning any other potential survivor or whistleblower that if they come forward, they would also be publicly punished. So the other thing we found out is that one of the current executives, the one recorded lying about me, had been implicated in sexual violence incidents in his past work with a youth human rights organization. The organization's board actually released a statement confirming this. We then found out that he had also been reported 4 times internally at TPO. So the man leading the charge to deny that TPO had a harassment problem was himself implicated in quite a few harassment problems. So that man left TPO in 2020 and was hired at a federal political party in Canada, which got wind of the many allegations against him and in rather predictable fashion tried to cover for him. He eventually resigned when it hit the national news. The other former TPO executive whose speech I interrupted went into provincial politics and created his own scandal when he covered up harassment and racism in the campaign he was managing. The last I heard, he had been promoted to the party's central campaign committee. So that's where we are. Things are continuing to unravel in this situation. A growing group of former staff and members of TPO are organizing an open letter, and almost 40 people have added their statements so far. Global Affairs Canada did not renew their funding to the organization, which was about $9 million. But other than that, they have not put any measures in place to rein in organizations like this or hold them accountable. With COVID, many development and aid organizations have withdrawn their staff from various countries. And given all of this, that's probably for the best. It's hard to do much analysis on all of this, as it's still rather raw and still unfolding, but a few things I wanted to mention. I think we'll continue to see staff and former staff of various organizations go rogue and start pushing back on these issues in novel ways, like using social media and hashtag campaigns in a kind of networked whistleblowing. Unions would be helpful, but are not necessarily of help. Most nonprofit staff are not unionized, and unions sometimes replicate a lot of these problems themselves. And finally, the ruling classes like to use charities and foundations as reputation laundering and to justify their enormous wealth accumulation, or to help them pry open communities to resource extraction, which is often accompanied by increased violence, including sexual violence towards local people in the area. Violence in these organizations then is not just functioning as a kind of interpersonal or behavioral problem or a matter of a few bad apples, but is an exercise of power in a way that power maintains itself, including shutting up dissenters and protecting the ability of these organizations to continue with business as usual. So I think that's almost it for my time, and I'll pass things off to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. We'll have a virtual hand clapping that you can't really hear, but thank you very much for that. Okay, so our next speaker, Suzanne, are you in good shape? Okay, so Suzanne Berliner-Weiss, she's muted at this point. Elise, can you unmute Suzanne?
I can suggest I cannot unmute her. She has to do it by herself.
Oh, okay. So Suzanne, you have to unmute yourself.
There you go. Perfect.
There you go. Perfect. Okay.
Okay,
Where you go.
right, hold on. I hope this works. Can you see me? Yes. Like all women, I've coped with the threat of sexual and physical assault and harassment. For women, this threat is omnipresent. It was a constant hazard of my younger years. Later, the danger of sexual attack shaped decisions of where I lived and with whom, where I worked, and whether I felt able to speak and act freely. All told, I suffered more than a dozen threatened sexual attacks. I suspect that this count is not unusual. When I joined the Socialist Workers' Party, the SWP, USA in 1959 at the age of 18, anxiety of sexual assault was an obstacle to my participation in political activity. The threat could come from a stranger or from an intimate friend. I fell victim to this threat in the dormitory of a socialist conference. It was evening, and an intimate friend flew into a rage. He bellowed and whacked me with furniture and props flying around. It was behind closed doors, but the roar was heard outside the room, and the assault left visible marks on my face. Yet, the next day, my socialist friends averted their eyes and showed no concern. A couple of years later, I suffered another such attack, but this time it drew attention and helped push the organization to come to a decision. The party declared it would not tolerate violence by its members against women, whatever the circumstances. How strictly was this enforced? No reports were given, but I know of 2 cases where prominent male members were expelled for intimidating conduct. On one occasion, I experienced an attempted sexual assault from a fellow party member. I repelled the attacker and made no report. I felt I had taught the guy a lesson and he was unlikely to try again. I know of a few other such violations that were not acted on. So the party's policy of no violence was not so easy to enforce. We needed a Me Too movement, but that was many years in coming. All in all, the no violence code in the party had an impact. The young women leaders who pressed for it were reflecting a new understanding in society as a whole. That is what made this norm effective. When I came to socialism, the Socialist Workers' Party USA was a small group, mostly male, a problematic milieu for young women seeking to be heard. In fact, it was hard to get a word in edgewise. I could only deduce that my voice was ignored because I was a woman and I was young. I was indignant, but the situation only reflected the male character of the society as a whole. I stuck around because the party's view of politics spoke to my heart and explained the world. In addition, it was for equal rights for women. We studied the works of Friedrich Engels and his vision of women's full liberation through socialism. Curiously, we paid no attention to what Engels said about violence against women. In class-divided society, Engels said, quote, "The wife is delivered over unconditionally into the power of the husband. If he kills her, he is only exercising his rights," unquote. the importance of this passage became clear to me much later as we entered the Me Too movement. Engels explained that for most of human existence, women have been equals of men and have played leading role. But women's subjugation came with the rise of private property and the state. That is, along with the burden of class oppression, of being the second sex. Only with the advent of socialist revolution would women finally begin to be recognized as equal partners. I decided to dedicate my life to fighting for a new society based not on profit, but on human needs. Even so, although we were all for women's equality, it seemed to be only an idea discussed, but not translated into action. No one knew how to include women and make them feel welcome and appreciated for their potential and for what they could contribute. Women, although few in the party ranks, were relatively more numerous than in the mainstream political life. They made a great organizational contribution. The women much older than me were tough, experienced, and strong-willed. Yes, they tended to do women's tasks, but they did so as socialists, not as wives, and as independent fighters. Few women, however, were represented on the party's policy-making bodies. In the mid-1960s, many young women from the universities joined our movement. The proportion of women among new recruits was much higher than among the older members. The young women members were in the forefront of the mass radical struggles. They took the party by storm and changed it profoundly. They insisted that more women be recognized and elected to the National Committee, a policy-making body. They demanded the party's commitment to women's equality, that it be now translated into action. The transformation was embraced with joy, especially by the veteran women members. The young women were also leaders in the women's liberation movement for birth control and control of our own body, choice on the abortion issue, freedom in sexual relations, child care, and equal opportunity. The feminist radicalization also inspired many working class women to seek jobs in non-traditional lines of work, that is, higher paying fields previously closed to them, such as in law, medicine, and other professions, and also in industrial jobs with equal pay. I took part in this effort, first in the party's print shop in New York, and later in oil refineries in Louisiana and Virginia. The mass women's movement was deeply influenced by the African American struggle for freedom now. The term women's liberation was itself inspired by demands for Black liberation. Marxists had long recognized women as doubly exploited as a sex and as workers. We also explained that women of color are triply oppressed. We understood that women's oppression prevailed before capitalism, It's deeper than capitalism and we'll outlive it. We call it patriarchy, the patriarchy. Just as Blacks are an oppressed nationality, women are an oppressed sex. Women, like Blacks, have allies in their struggles whose help is essential to women's victories. Today we call it intersectionality. The party took the issues of discrimination and equal opportunity to heart and encouraged Blacks and women to come into the leadership of the party. A network of assertive members created a culture of debate on women's oppression and related issues that embraced the entire organization. The party showed it could learn from the mass movement. We in the SWP viewed the revolutionary struggle as a combined process in which workers' resistance to capitalist exploitation overlapped with and was reinforced by other struggles against other forms of oppression. So the working class, the Black resistance, women's rights, all have their own struggle for democratic rights and are part and parcel of the working class struggle and rely on each other for support. Later, the broad movement declined and the party turned away from it and forgot the many lessons learned from the living movements. Nonetheless, its record in my youth showed what can be achieved and how to achieve it. In the 1980s and after, the party retreated from this understanding and reverted to what Marxists call a workerist approach, that is, seeing all struggles as expressions of the antagonism between workers and employers. Today, the challenge of women's liberation remains a troubled issue for many socialist groups, and they often lag behind the spirit of women's radicalism in social movements. Despite all the progress of recent decades, in my experience, many women continue to be alienated regarding participation in Marxist organizations. All too often, conversations on Marxist strategy and tactics are not linked to the experience and wisdom gained in the living social and political movements. This tends to repel women and other disadvantaged social layers. Although the Marxist program affirms the goal of women's liberation, this is undercut by the reality of practice, day-to-day chauvinist culture. Women generally are still slow to intervene in discussions concentrated on Marxist theory and strategy. Yet, in the mass movements, women play an equal role among the organizers and spokespersons, and often predominate. The struggle for our rights has shown that women's oppression will be abolished not by women alone, but by alliances with every section of the exploited and oppressed, including males who seek to eradicate the patriarchy and capitalism, the systems that shackles and imprisons us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Okay, we're ready to move to our third presentation. This is jointly presented by Paul Kellogg and myself. we'll try to sort of chair ourselves, but Elise is in the background helping us to keep time. Paul will begin this presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elise, for helping us out, and thanks to all the other panelists. To Chelsea and Suzanne who just spoke. Our paper is called Sexism and the Left, 3 Case Studies. Could you go to the next slide, Elise? Thank you. Perfect. Uh-oh. There we go. So this is a joint paper written based upon our shared experience, Abby and myself, politically going back to the 1970s. And that has from the beginning been framed by a slogan, no socialism. It's actually the full phrase was no women's liberation without socialism, no socialism without women's liberation. It was a politics that saw the two things as completely linked, that you couldn't get one without the other. This presentation is based on a longer paper, and we're looking at 3 case studies where this practice in the left did not live up to the promise of the slogan. The first one, which I'll look at, is from Britain, a case of sexual assault. The second one, which Abby will look at, we should continue the British one a bit and then do the Canadian study, Sexist Faction. And the final one is about suicide in the case study in Russia. Can we take a look at the next slide? We were helped in this by a framework that Abby introduced me to from Charles Mills, who in his book, The Racial Contract, talked about epistemologies of ignorance, basically trying to interrogate how do hegemonic ideas that reinforce oppression, such as racism, how do they continue over and over and over through the years, through generations. He looks at the way in which epistemologies of ignorance, of not looking at certain things, about not understanding certain things, continue over generations. In the left, these case studies, we think, reveal an epistemology of ignorance at another level. In terms of both sexist practices within left organizations and feminist analyses about society, there is a tendency to epistemologically minimize, dismiss, distort, and forget, at least in the 3 case studies we looked at. Okay. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first case study, very briefly, is about Britain. It's the most recent one. These are in reverse chronological order. This was a crisis that emerged publicly in the Socialist Workers' Party of Britain in the late 2012. It is actually an internal crisis that has been going back to 2010. It was public enough. The reason the New Statesman is there, if you look in the upper left corner, Comrades at War, the inside story of how the SWP, UK's biggest far left party, tore itself apart, it actually made the front page of the New Statesman at a certain point in time. We became aware of it when there was an expulsion. Suddenly there was an expulsion of 4 people, and they'd been expelled for discussing on Facebook about what to do about a sexual assault series of allegations that had happened inside the party. The details that emerged were quite appalling about a middle-aged leading member, a male leading member. While Chelsea was speaking about the experience in the NGO, it reminded me of the parallels between the story here in terms of the role of leading male members. In this case, it was a sexual assault allegation against a 17-year-old party member. And 2 years later, that same person said, actually, it was rape and I want this looked into. I want it to be investigated. It was investigated. The disputes committee said it was unproven. I won't go into all the details. I'll simply say this. The SWP handled it in such a way as if there had been no lessons from 40 years of feminism, from 50 years of feminism. The entire history of feminism, which has helped educate many people about how to deal with issues of sexual assault, were absent from within the party. It led to an enormous crisis, a cover-up of the crisis, and hundreds of people resigned. It eventually led to Abby and myself and a few others resigning from the sister group in Canada because of a refusal to pay attention to this, a refusal to actually make a statement about this crisis. So Suzanne said that the issue, an important issue, was left parties reflecting the new radicalizations that take place This is a case, I think, of a party that did not reflect the new radicalization, that the radicalization that had been happening for many years around issues to do with women, reflected in, and this is where I'll end, on an unfortunate habit that we encountered in the 80s and 90s when going over there, where the very term feminism was used as an insult. If you wanted to, say someone was not very politically advanced, you'd say they were an effing feminist. And there are numerous people who have documented that kind of thing. It's an awful story. There's some lessons to be learned from it. I'm going to stop there and pass it over to Abby, who will pick up the story in Canada.
Okay, thank you. Elise, can we have the next slide? So this is a story about a sexist faction. Factions are fairly common in small left organizations or large left organizations, but this one's self-identified as in an unusual way. So the International Socialists of Canada was formed in February of 1975, emerging from various forces around the left, including the Waffle Movement for an Independent Socialist Canada. And from its founding convention, the IS, or International Socialists, was explicitly committed to women's liberation. Many of the group's members, and I was among them, thought of themselves with very little reflection as feminists, assuming it was the same as the term women's liberation. In the spring of 1976, we had a national committee meeting, which was a delegated leading body organization. And it was in the weeks prior to this NC, or National Committee meeting, that one of the youngest members of our group revealed that he felt extremely uncomfortable about a drinking circle that he had been invited to participate in. And this group presented itself as a casual, friendly, social organization among selected, trusted comrades. They were all leading or highly influential male members of the International Socialists. And what we learned is that central to their conversations, apparently quite systematically, were ranking all the women in the IS according to what they called their desirability for sexual advances. The ranking criteria include various categories. Among them, we were told, the size of the women's breasts. They knew that the IS was formally committed to women's liberation, but they still chose to call themselves the sexist faction, and they would meet regularly and raise their steins of beers and wild cheers. When the rest of the full-time leading body, the executive committee, which was a smaller group than the National Committee, heard of this, we were appalled, men and women, and immediately started concerns about how this might affect our next steps. It was decided originally that a motion of censure of the prominent leading member, one of the leading members of the International Socialists at the time, was also part of this drinking circle. And it was decided that at least a motion of censure should be carried out at our April meeting. As the meeting unfolded, we had discussions about various aspects of leadership. And on the second day, it was decided that this should probably be a motion of suspension. It was known to everyone except the particular leading member, because we anticipated, and we were correct, that this would be met with very aggressive behavior. Attending this meeting of the International Socialists were two international comrades, one from the UK, from the Socialist Workers' Party, then called the International Socialists, and one from the American sister organization. So when the vote to suspend the membership of this leading member took place by a large majority, this now disciplined member, furiously swearing and shouting, indicated he was going to quit the IS, walked out. Another member stood up and objected to this, and the UK comrade, far more experienced than us and with a great deal of prestige, said, "We have to understand that this is a, quote, classic example of petty bourgeois individualism." At this point, temperatures rose, and another member of the sexist faction stood up, pushed the British comrade through a glass window, and he was only saved from a serious fall in a two-story building because of a small balcony. The UK comrade literally dusted the bits of glass off of his clothing, urging calm, and stressed that we continue to focus on the work of building our small revolutionary socialist organization. which we did. The IS survived this early stress, proud that we had challenged the grotesque display of sexism and proceeded to widen our influence and our reach over several years. But we were left with several scars. In hindsight, this notion of petty bourgeois individualism, a highly unclear term of abuse, widely applied to a myriad of challengers and challenges, internally and externally, rather than naming what it was, actually convinced us that this was really just the response of some bad apples. We didn't discuss misogyny, we didn't discuss sexism or patriarchy. Over the remainder of the 70s and 80s, the International Socialists grew and got increasingly into the orbit of the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain. We would go annually to meetings of the leadership of the SWP, led by a small group of very, very influential, very experienced people much older than us, including principally one Egil Gluckstein or Tony Cliff. Cliff was among the most vocal, opposing what was referred to by the SWP as an adaptation to feminism, a position widely adopted by the SWP, originally a minority view and eventually becoming the full view of the party. The IS in Canada was often in the crosshairs of the SWP leadership, seeing as one of the groups that had a problem of adaptation. We were sometimes shamed in front of other groups. And we tried to sort of create, I was involved in this, a conception that no, we were women's liberationists and not feminists, a position which many years later I came to see as untenable. However, the theoretical confusion continues. Elise, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So Tony Cliff published widely, including a book called Class Struggle and Women's Liberation, 1640 to the Present, which you see on your screen. And in this text, the position was advanced that feminism, I'm quoting from the end of this quote here, feminism sees the basic division in the world as that between men and women. For Marxism, however, the fundamental antagonism in society is that between classes, not sexism. There can be no compromise between these two views, even though some quote unquote socialist feminists have in recent years tried to bridge the gap. So the Socialist Workers' Party, the International Socialists in the time of the sexist faction, was actually already involved in a faction fight of its own with a group called Women's Voice. Women's Voice was a publication by women in the party, published between 1972 and in 1977, Women's Voice groups were established. And later, by a later time through the next decade, the Women's Voice groups were actually seen as a threat to the party and were disciplined and were told that they either had to disband or they would be expelled from functioning. And the argument was that rather than Women's Voice groups being a bridge between the Socialist Workers' Party and the women's movement to influence the women's movement, instead the women's movement was crossing the bridge the other way and influencing the Socialist Workers' Party in a way that was, again, this adaptation to feminism. So if we return to this perspective of the 1976 moment, looking in hindsight, the concept of petty bourgeois individualism that was sort of the moniker of that event of the sexist faction actually was a moment that could be perceived as a pivot when you have the formation of an epistemology of ignorance. These individuals were summarily challenged, but the processes that led to those individuals, the structures, the systems, were actually left untouched, as if there was nothing wrong with an organization that generated that kind of overt and violent sexism. So from this vantage point, there is a space to be said for looking back in time with the contemporary politics of feminism and socialism that we understand. And I'll pass it back to Paul now for the third and last case study.
Thank you, Abby. Here comes the next slide. Now, the truth is, Abby and myself have known about the first two case studies for a little while. With that, we've been, working through the SWP and the IS thing for a few years. This one was a surprise. This one, we didn't go looking for this. I was doing research in the Russian Revolution for particular reasons and uncovered some material that's not exactly hidden, but it's not exactly highlighted about an historic moment in that period of time. The historic moment is 1903. In 1903, there is the paper down there that says Iskra was the paper of the Russian left at the time. There was a big conference in 1903 by those people who supported Iskra. Some of the names, faces are there. You see the face of Lenin. You see the face of that's not anyway. Plekhanov. I can't read it, but that's Lenin, Plekhanov, Martov, and Vera Zasulich. I'll get to the other two people later who are up there. And it ended up as supposed to be a unity event for the left. It ended up in splitting in 3 different ways, an enormous split. There's many, many different interpretations about this split. We won't go into them. Some people say it is reform versus revolution. Some people say it's just sectarian wrangling. It was extremely emotional. It was extremely divisive. And there's a hidden background to this that's extremely relevant to this talk about an epistemology of ignorance that was being constructed then related to issues to do that we would say today are to do with feminism. One of the 3 people involved, there are 3 key people involved in the project. Besides the people listed here was Lenin, Martov, and another fellow, Potresov. And Potresov indicated a few years after the fact, he says, look, people know about 1903, you don't know about 1902. By 1902, relations amongst the people on our little tiny editorial board had already collapsed. We couldn't talk to each other. It was completely icy. Why was that? He said, because we had come up against what Potresov called the amoralism of Lenin and Plekhanov, of 2 of the key individuals. What was this about? Well, this is where the other 2 people come in, who are the bigger picture there, that you won't know of these people probably. The man in the background is Bauman. His last name is Bauman. There are institutes named after him all over Russia. He was a martyr of the Russian Revolution, died in 1905, killed by a far-right person, etc. The woman there in the checkered shirt is Claudia Protoko, who in most accounts is not her. It took me a long time to find her name. She's anonymous in most accounts. This picture was taken when they were in exile. While they were in exile, they had a relationship, no big deal. They have a relationship. They broke up, no big deal. She got pregnant. In that in itself, these things happen. Bauman, however, took it upon himself when he was in a different city to make cartoons about her being pregnant, making cartoons about her being the Madonna with a pregnant belly and all the rest of it. We would call it in the current moment what he was doing slut shaming. She became aware of it. She was very upset. It was a very, very difficult thing. And she killed herself. And then she didn't just kill herself. She was a party activist. Before she killed her suicide note was a 15-page letter written to these people, written to the Iskra editorial board, saying, you have to save the reputation of the party. The party cannot exist if it tolerates this kind of behavior. This kind of amoralism is what the words that were being used at the time, use different words than we use, will not, you have to save your honor. The majority agreed with her. Martov agreed, Vera Zasulich agreed, Alexander Potresov agreed. Lenin and Plekhanov vehemently disagreed. And they disagreed in a very interesting way with very interesting formulations. They said, this is a personal matter. It is not a political matter. The personal must not affect the political work of the party. And at the end of the day, they sort of wore everyone out through their argument, and everyone agreed to just let the thing go. I'll leave that story there. The personal is political became a factor again in the 1980s and 90s. That was one of the fundamental slogans of the women's movement, that the personal is political. And actually today, we kind of take it for granted in a certain sense. We know that the bully at work is it's not an individual, just an individual psychological problem of being a bully, although it can be a psychological problem, but the bully is socially constructed by systemic issues that create masculinity, toxic masculinity, patriarchy, and all the rest of it. It's fascinating that language, that very language, was at dispute in 1902, 1903. So that case study indicated that there might be a connection about the constructions of epistemology of ignorance might have roots other than in the most recent or the last 2 generations of radicalization. It's interesting that there is a moment here that might be of some importance. And if I think I've got 30 seconds left, if I can just go to the last slide. I don't even need a last slide. Because the conclusion, our conclusion was, Abby and I concluded that we wouldn't really have one. That the conclusion is we've got 3 case studies. We think that there's something going on that is creating a resistance inside the left, the traditional Marxist left that Abby and I know relatively well, that has made it difficult for that left to deal with these issues that the feminist movement has put on the table. Why that will happen is a product for a longer analysis, and hopefully this will have these 3 case studies will be of some help and some relevance to trying to figure out this problem and address it. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. That concludes the presenting part of our discussion. We have some participants in the room. If you have questions, please send your questions in the chat, and we'll be able to deal with them. And we also have the opportunity for any panelists who might have questions for other panelists to also put questions in the chat, or you can just indicate with a show of hands if you have any questions. So we have an audience of about 16, and we'll see if we have any questions or concerns. Alex also is present on the panel. And Alex, do you have any comments or questions that you would like, or things that you would like to add while people are collecting their thoughts?
Not really. I have a couple of questions in my own head that I'm trying to formulate, but I'll wait to kind of see what comes up.
Okay. We have an open question here. There was a question that came up earlier about, this is for you, Chelsea. Can you indicate why you had left the identity of this organization anonymous?
Yeah, so I was referring to it as TPO, or the Progressive Organization. I mean, the biggest reason for that is just the amount of backlash that's occurred already to date in speaking publicly about all of this. So yeah, just, you know, that was the main reason why. And I think also what Paul had mentioned about the sort of the bully is, it's not necessarily an individual problem. The same thing with an organization like this. I don't think it's necessarily a bad apple organization either. It's really kind of a systemic issue, and I was trying to hint at that with naming all of the succession of scandals in similar organizations. And I think there's also many parallels between Paul and Abby, what you've described, and Suzanne, what you've described, and, you know, not even formally institutionalized spaces. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just watching the chat as the questions come in. Alex has a question. Maybe Paul, you could take this. What has the response been to sharing that story from 1903 in leftist circles?
Great question.
Are people shocked?
I've only shared it twice. Once with ideas left out, and once here. I'm writing it up now and put it out. So I'll tell you my response. It blew my mind. I had no idea. I had studied the 1903 thing backwards and forwards for years. And this thing by Potresov, which is in an article written in the German language, I had to get help to get it translated to read about it. And there's actually more details by Lydia Dan, who is Martov's sister, available in English that I've since discovered. I personally, my response as someone on the left is I think it's really significant. I think it tells us why we need to take, there's an ethical component to feminism that the left is resistant to feeling, because feminism is about taking women seriously in society. There's many different levels. That's one part of it. And this lack of ethical response from the section of the left might be related to some of the problems that Russian left had later on, because problems of ethics became profound in the 20s and 30s. So that's not really an answer to the question. That's just, personally, I think it's shocking. And I think there's a reason we don't know much about it, because it rips it reduces certain people's reputation. It reduces Lenin and Plekhanov's reputation a lot, and it raises the reputations of other people. Verza Sulich and Martov look very good in this, as opposed to Lenin and Plekhanov. Anyway, that's just my thoughts.
Okay, got a lot of things going on here. So, Suzanne, a question for you. I've heard of similar attitudes in the SWP with regard to interracial relationships and anti-Black racism, especially in the American Deep South. Were comrades discouraged from fraternizing with interracial relations because the workers would be alienated by such a thing? Suzanne, can you address that? You're muted, Suzanne.
I'm trying to figure this out. I don't quite understand the question. Apparently, comrades were discouraged from fraternizing interracially because the workers would be alienated. I know nothing about that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with that. I just want to say a general thing that, you know, this treatment of women as the second sex, the things that we've been, that every woman has had experience with, of being threatened in so many ways, with sexual you know, anxiety and attacks and that sort of thing. Well, I mean, so we've seen that in movies. I've seen that in books. It's, you know, as Chelsea has said, it's part of the issue of our society, and that it has existed in our society since the beginning of private property, and that it's just part of the patriarchy, and it's not just part of the left. It's part of society. We find it throughout society. Now, why is the left excused from these crimes, or these, I'll call them crimes, you know? No, we just are affected by that because we're part of that society. And we try as socialists, as social activists, to confront these issues. But it all depends, I think, on the struggle itself, how much it advances, and the consciousness of both men and women, and because we're talking about women and sexuality right now. And so I would say that we have, it's a constant uphill battle to confront these issues. And the Me Too movement has been a very big advance for us, but not big enough. And so we have, and it's a constant battle uphill, because for all the advances we made, for instance, with abortion rights, we're constantly moving that rock up, back up. You know, it's like a rock falling down coming down the hill again. You move it up and it comes down a hill again. The battle that we win has not been secured because we have not changed society, and we have to confront the question of our rights is a constant battle. And as I said, even if we have the opportunity of succeeding into a socialist society, we still will have to confront that issue of equal rights as human beings.
Okay, we have a number of questions in the chat here that are there's one that's just been added, but they're asking questions about the systemic nature of this. So one question, I'm thinking the left and NGOs reflect the patriarchal forms of organizing, and if we are going to change these regarding tolerating sexual harassment, don't we have to challenge the systems we use and what behavior we admire? I think this is a problem with both racism and sexism. Another one, is there an intersection between the racist and misogynistic pressures on comrades regarding mixed relationships that has the same root? And then all of us are asked to comment on the point that Chelsea made about trade unions and the yet to be organized. And supposedly workers of advanced consciousness, revolutionary socialists, are supposed to get this correct. And maybe we should address that. So what I'm thinking are, maybe what we'll do is, I'll just see if some ideas to deal, any suggestions for how to deal with misogynistic violence. So we're seeing a lot of questions, and Alex has commented that it's quite likely that this is even wider than we think, because there is, you know, the phenomenon, and certainly Paul and my research, and I think what all of us are doing is indicating what should be obvious is unseen, and there's a lot of covering up. So what I'm wondering, if maybe we have about 7 more minutes until we close, if we could just go around the room and all of us could just take a couple of minutes to deal with these questions about the systemic nature of the kinds of issues that we're seeing, things that appear personal that are really political, and also any suggestions for how we might change this. I think there is one other question that I should put in here for Paul. This is from John. During Lenin's final illness, he famously broke off relations with Stalin and demanded Stalin's dismissal from the post of general secretary because he had committed discourtesy towards Nadezhda Krupskaya. His final comments on discourtesy towards oppressed people were in the same vein. Do you think Lenin had learned something since the time of Iskra? So that's a very specific one for you, Paul. So maybe you can start and just take a couple minutes to address that. So I'll pass that to you, Paul, and then all of us can just comment on this these various questions about systemic racism and sexism that have come up. And then I think we'll be close to our closing time. So Paul, why don't you go first and just watch your time?
John's asked a very big question that I can't really answer in 2 minutes. I think that the issue was not an individual issue about this or that person, either Lenin or Plekhanov, etc. I think it reflected the internalization of what we would today call patriarchal norms of operations inside the way in which the left functioned. They wouldn't have seen it that way at that time because this language didn't exist. But I think that's what we saw. And what it does for me, though, is make me pay more attention to that section of the Russian left that saw things in ethical terms. And Martov as an individual did, but there were also others on the left who saw that socialism is not about something that you try to get to. In the process of getting to your goal is as important as the goal itself. That how you get there will shape what you arrive at. And that's in a certain sense what ethics is. And the Bolsheviks kind of disagreed with that. The Bolsheviks didn't think that they could separate the ends from the means, that there could be a hard, way of approaching things, but you get to a good end in the end. It didn't work. It ended in catastrophe. But that's, so I can't say anything more about that than that now, John. It's a very interesting and important question. And that's all I'll say. If I've got 30 more seconds, Elise's thing about how to deal with this in terms of restorative justice is really important. I think the best moments of practice that we had, and we had some good moments of practice in the years in the IS, was when these things happened. Two things. In the first instance, that the person who brings forward the complaint, you try to get them support. The first instance, you say, look, what support do you need? Like, take them seriously and take it seriously that someone's been injured. And second one is that there's an immediate consequence for the person who was the aggressor, an immediate consequence, whether it's expulsion or whatever discipline, but you withdraw them from contact with the people that they're involved with until the thing is resolved. And that is not the same thing as restorative justice, but it's kind of the first step towards thinking about then what do we do with it. But you first have to take seriously the person bringing forward the problem. And secondly, make sure that there's some consequences immediately for the person against whom the charges are brought, that it just doesn't hang there, which it too often did in certain circumstances. But I really think the restorative justice question is a really big one and important one that Elise has raised. And so that's all I'll say.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Chelsea, 2 minutes.
Okay, I just wanted to briefly respond to the earlier question about, I think it was the SWP and the ban on interracial relationships. And I just wanted to mention that the organization I was speaking about, actually, while I worked there, had no sex policy. And that was only for workers who were working in their overseas programs, so in African countries, which myself and others pushed back on and quite rightfully, I think, called it racist. There was quite a lot of backlash to that. So just to, again, point out that these patterns, racism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, all of this is happening sort of across different settings, and people who are working on supposedly pushing back on social issues in general. The role of unions, I think the nonprofit sector is very sort of ununionized. I think the figure is like 70% of workers in Toronto, I came across a statistic, are not part of unions, nonprofit workers. And there's a very high rate of women working in that sector. And I think there's many barriers to that, to them being unionized, but also I think that the sort of work that is being done in that sector is seen as already sort of caring work. And I think people kind of like come to identify with the organizations they're working for a lot of the time and don't necessarily want to take what they would see as an antagonistic stance. But also I think there's just a lot of precarity in that sector and a lot of expectation of particularly women in the sector to kind of just do the work for, not for free, but almost for free. So there's a lot of that going on, a lot of burnout, overwork, and so on going on in that sector. But I also think it's potentially a natural place for labor organizing to take place. Yeah, and I think just in terms of the systemic issues, I think the sort of issues of racism, colonial attitudes, and so on is very stark in the development and aid sector, particularly, just because of the nature of the type of work they're doing and the interventions that they're doing internationally. So a lot of those dynamics are coming up, and there's a lot of sort of complicated issues of the types of sexual violence and racialized violence that's happening with workers in other countries, with aid workers who are going to other countries, with people who are based in Canada, the US, Europe, and so on, targeting local populations and places where they're working. So there's a lot of sort of complicated dynamics going on there. And then just to the sort of last question about ways to tackle this. I know Paul mentioned restorative justice. I think there's a lot of sort of transformative justice type of things going on in racialized communities, particularly Indigenous communities, certain left spaces. And then I think exploring what abolitionists are writing about is a potential good starting point for people who want to look more into these issues.
Thank you, Chelsea. Suzanne, can you give us 2 minutes? You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Okay, I think we should go back to what I was saying, and that is that the understanding of Marxism, as I learned it, is that the class struggle is really multifaceted. This society, capitalist society, has at its base hatred of the other, and it's hatred of color, it's hatred of women, and it's hatred of difference. And all we have movements today that represent resistance against this hatred. The Black struggle, the women's struggle, intersectional movements. And they all work together against this basic, fundamental poison in this society of hatred. And so it's a combined struggle. When we say the workers' struggle, we just don't mean trade unions, who themselves, the workers in the trade unions, have to learn from the struggles, their own struggles and the struggles of the mass organizations. So that's what my contribution is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just put my panelist hat on and just say 45 seconds. There are two levels of this type of research that I found. One is the story, and the other is, why is it so hard to learn from the story? I mean, after all these years of socialist practice and seeing these types of events, every single time they happen, they seem like they're an exception, a surprise. We have no basis for knowing how to deal with it. We are shocked, we are appalled. And so the construction of the paper that Paul and I have worked on, including, you know, the way I was a founding member of the International Socialists, I was very young. I was very, you know, overwhelmed by the burden of responsibility I'd taken on in starting this small socialist organization. We looked to direction and leadership, and it was really comforting to think we expelled the sexist and we didn't have to deal with sexism. It was kind of it was a comfort. And actually, I mean, I had to sort of dig into my own archives in order to reconstruct the story, because it was not part of the oral tradition. It was a bad person who was gone, and we didn't want to relate to it. And then many years later, I founded the IS. and it was around women's liberation and socialism. And I left the SWP and the IS because of a failure to pay attention to the most minimal element of a commitment to women's liberation, which is consent. It's an absolutely basic ABC. And so the question of the forgetting, the conscious activity of forgetting, which Charles Mills has given us this framework of epistemology of ignorance, I think is also something that we have to deal with. Not just why does it keep happening, but why do we not discuss it and learn the lessons? So we are out of time. And now I'll put my chair's hat back on. And that's a very good reason to thank this conference, Historical Materialism and la Grande Transition, for making platforms available for these types of conversations. And to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Elise, for your absolutely fantastic tech help, and Paolo and the whole team that have organized this. And I do understand this has been recorded, so it will be available that all of us can sort of put on our social media, and we can continue to have the conversation. So thank you all. Stay safe, stay well. If you're at U of T like me, stay censored. Please honor the censor. And au revoir, bonsoir.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all the panelists, people that presented today. I will close this webinar. Thanks. Bye.